Hey guys, this is Josh here with Trillium Wild Edibles, and today I want to bring you a review on the Foragers Harvest, a guide to identifying, harvesting, and preparing edible wild plants by the author Samuel Thayer. Now, a couple of months ago, I'd done a book review on his second book called Nature's Garden, and that is an amazing book as well. This is the very first book that I know of that he has written. While this book is very good, it's not as in-depth as his second book, but it's still amazingly in-depth, and it does give a lot more information in certain areas that the second book that he's written doesn't exactly cover. So let's get inside of this book and take a look at what's inside. Now, like every other book on the subject, there's always a short and brief introduction, and in Samuel Thayer's books, one of the reasons I like him as an author is because he gives a longer introduction than most of the other books on the subject. After his introduction, he'll generally have other sections where he talks about the meaning of wild food and the purpose and organization of this book. In the section of the purpose and organization of this book, he tells you a little bit about not only the purpose or organization, but he tells you about some of the rules that he likes to follow, for example, to provide a thorough account of each plant's use based on his own experiences. This is something that a lot of books on the subject don't actually do. They'll generally cover the subject in a way that seems copy and pasted, whereas he, Samuel Thayer, likes to go through and tell you his personal experiences, and the words are written from his own experiences. As you read through this book, you're going to see this, and throughout this whole book, it's sprinkled with little bits of humor. He also has a really good section on the history of foraging and wild food literature. This is a great section to read if you're interested in the history of the subject, because he goes into great depth and detail, talking about some of the books that have been written in the past, some of their flaws, and he also talks about how humans throughout the past 100,000 years or so have been using wild plants for food, and how important wild plants can be for our subsistence or for our natural and daily living. He also talks about, through this section, how wild plants have come out of favor for our daily lives. So this is a great section to read, and I highly encourage you to read the very beginning of this book all the way through. I encourage everybody to read this book from front to very end because of how much information he goes into throughout this book. Now, after we've gotten through some of that, he talks about getting started with wild edible plants. In this section, he talks about things like why people should forage and how foraging can be healthy for us and how we can add it to our daily diet through the things that we normally eat or on top of the things that we normally eat and consume. Throughout this section, he spends about 10 to 13 pages talking about different subjects like foraging, the ultimate survival skill, and he has certain things imprinted in bold, as you can probably see right here, where he talks about some very important aspects to foraging and how they can be added to our diet. He talks a little bit about where to forage and some of the legalities and comfortabilities you might have to go through and understand in your specific area. He doesn't cover every area specifically, but he does give you some general guidelines to follow here, so that way you're not breaking any laws and you aren't causing a major impact on the land that you are foraging on. Now, another really great section in the front of this book that I enjoy, I read this very frequently because I enjoy the spin that he puts on it. And by spin, I mean his own personal experiences and his personal humor. He adds a lot of humor within this text. He spends about 13 pages talking on plant identification and foraging safety. He covers Ewell Gibbons, which Ewell Gibbons is a very, very popular wild food author, and unfortunately he passed away several years ago. In the very beginning of this book, he talks about how Ewell Gibbons didn't die because some media outlets actually tried to portray Ewell Gibbons' death as being attributed to wild foods, when that's not actually the case. Samuel Thayer gives a very good and detailed account of some of the things Ewell Gibbons did and didn't do that attributed to his death, which helps us, the reader, to interpret or appreciate the fact that Ewell Gibbons didn't die eating wild foods. He died because of natural causes and other things attributed within his normal lifestyle that weren't associated with the subject of foraging wild edibles. This book is complete with a lot of charts and a lot of graphic information, and by graphic information, I don't mean information that is unreadable or unpalatable or graphic information in the sense of like pornography, but he gives graphics and charts like you can see right here on the 5 steps of identifying wild plants. And he goes through tentative identification, compare your plant to a reliable reference, double and triple check, finding more specimens, and assess contradictory confidence. And he gives great explanations underneath all of these things outlined in bold. He spends about 13 pages in the front of this book talking about plant identification and the safety factors according to him, and how you can identify plants according to different factors and how that can be dangerous. Once we've gotten past that, he spends several pages talking about harvesting and preparation methods for wild plant foods. He gives you some of his own personal thoughts on using wild plants. Like, for example, for most foragers, gathering a plant is an exciting, awe-inspiring, even sacred moment, and the process of turning raw produce taken from the outdoors into fine sustenance is almost magical. He gives you some generalized information on harvesting and preparing shoots and stalks, as well as underground parts of the plant, or what he calls underground vegetables. He even talks about leafy greens. And whenever it comes to underground parts of a plant, there's this very good detailed chart with photographs, color photographs, that tells you the differences between taproots, tubers, rhizomes, bulbs, and corms. And he gives a great verbal definition or text definition of each one of these aligned with a photograph or a color photograph. So that's really helpful and useful to have in your arsenal for information on foraging wild plants. In this section of the book, he goes through the detailed analysis of different foraging tools, and he shows you a couple of the foraging tools that he uses here, like a digging stick versus more like a digging trowel here. So this is a really good piece of information to have because it lets you, the reader, know that sometimes tool A will be useful for plant A or B versus tool B might be useful for plant C and D. So he gives you good information to let you know that just because a tool will dig up roots and tubers and corms, it may not be the best one to use for any specific plant. It will take experience and knowledge for you, the forager, to go through and determine which one is going to be the most useful for you. Now, once we've gotten through and read all of that, he spends about 13 pages talking about the storage or storing of wild foods. He briefly covers each aspect of canning, drying, pickling, and things of that nature to help you sustain your harvest for an even longer period of time. Throughout this section, he even gives some photographs, and he also outlines important items in bold to let you know some of the basic rules of canning and drying and different storage methods for wild foods. He also briefly covers how some wild foods do not store or can as well as they may dry. So that's something to keep in mind because not every wild plant will dry good or store good being canned or pickled. And he covers a lot of that information in the front of this book. Now, on that same token or same note, he also goes into better detail in each plant's description or in each plant's chapter to help you understand which plants dry better or can better or even pickle better. Once we've gotten through and read all of this front part of the section of the book, and we've read through the first 72 pages, because yes, he spends 72 whole pages talking about plant identification and safety, how foraging can be good for us. He talks about storage and preparation and harvesting, and then he talks about timing your wild harvest. because timing is something that some foragers, unfortunately, do not focus on near as much. I try to focus on this in my videos as much as I can, because if you harvest the wrong plant at the wrong time, or even the right plant at the wrong time, you will be very disappointed and in some cases can even poison yourself. He completes the section of timing the wild harvest with a complete color-coded chart on the times of year you want to harvest a certain plant or a certain plant part. And he gives this in relation to his latitude and his longitude or to his geographical area. He also explains before you get into this chart how you can apply this knowledge to where you live based upon how far north or how far south you live from where he is and where he's giving you this information from. Now, beginning on page 78, he starts to get into the different plant accounts and the different species that he talks about in this book. While this book doesn't cover a very large number of species, it does give you enough information on each one to actually add them to your diet, unlike your basic field guide, which will just give you a few basic sentences for the most part on each plant. So instead of being a list with a large number of plants, he decided to go the opposite route and talk about each plant in such detail that you can appreciate them and add them to your daily diet and understand how to harvest them effectively and efficiently. While this book is not complete with pictures to give you a complete aspect of plant identification for each species, his description is vivid enough with text so that way you understand exactly what you're looking for and the plant's range, its height in centimeters and inches. So yes, he covers that in centimeters and inches, which I think is really, really nice. After each plant's description, he gives the range and habitat of each plant, where you can expect to find it, not only the parts of the country where you can expect to find it, but the type of environment or the type of forest environment it likes to grow. Whether it's in a mesic upland forest, or whether it's in a wetlands or creek bottoms or rivers or sand, he goes through all of that information here. Then he talks a little bit about harvest and preparation. These are the most detailed accounts of harvest and preparation that I have found in any foraging book. Samuel Thayer is one of the best authors when it comes to harvesting and preparation methods because he goes into such detail. The only downside is if you're wanting specific recipes, you won't necessarily find them in this book. He chooses to focus instead on giving you the generalized information in enough of a way so that way you can add these plants to your normal recipes without having to dig or copy specific recipes for each plant. Some plants will have more pages dedicated to them than others. Like, for example, some plants only have 5 to 10 pages, whereas some plants have almost 20 pages dedicated to just that one plant. And then he spends most of that time on harvesting and preparing that plant. Like, for example, cattail, he shows you some of the different cattail rhizomes here, and then he also shows you a cross-section of the rhizome showing the two distinct layers that a cattail can have. So he gives you a lot of information as you're digging through this book, so that way you can add these plants to your diet without being too terribly confused. And right now we're going to flip through and look at some of these colored photographs, just so that way you guys can see some of the detail he goes through in this book. As you can see, there are a lot of very good and detailed color photographs with each plant to help you appreciate the plants and understand what he's talking about in his text. And under each photograph, he gives very good subtext for each photograph to help you understand what you're looking at and to help you interpret what it is you're actually looking at. Throughout this book, one of the things that you're going to notice as you read through it is that he likes to sprinkle his descriptions and his explanations with not only his personal experiences, but a lot of humor. He's very good at adding humor, and he's also very good at being practical and realistic with his methods and descriptions, so that way you get a realistic idea of how to use these plants, but you also get a realistic idea on how they can be added to your diet, so that way you're not building yourself up. Another thing that's very important to note during this review is that he also gives bibliographies, or the sources that he gathered a lot of information from. And throughout the text of this book, you're going to see different sources listed in parentheses, and you can find the exact source of those bibliographies or sources listed in this section of the book. And there are a lot of bibliographies here. There's about 4 or 5 pages of bibliographies that he gives. After we've gotten through the sources or bibliographies, we get into what is one of my favorite parts of this whole book, is the glossary. And this is not only a text glossary as it appears here. He goes even more in depth. That's right, he steps it up a whole nother notch and starts giving you a pictorial glossary of parts of flowers, fruits and their clusters, simple leaf shapes and various leaf shapes, as well as roots and tubers and rhizomes. And he does this in such a way that not only do you have the pictorial glossary right here, but you have the verbal or text glossary right next to it. So it's a very good reference material to help you understand some of the terms or terminologies that are used in some of your other books or field guides. And of course, what educational book would not be complete without an index? None of them. He goes through and gives you a great index, and he lists the page numbers, and he also lists the plants by their scientific names in this index. So that right there is my book review of The Foragers Harvest, a guide to identifying, harvesting, and preparing edible wild plants by the author Samuel Thayer. I hope all of you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something, and I hope you guys buy this book. I'm not sponsored by Samuel Thayer by any means. I just really enjoy this book and have learned a whole lot from it. And I hope all of you guys can learn something from it as well. So I thank you all for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something. If you want to learn more about wild edible or medicinal plants, bushcraft, or even some of the books that go along with those subjects, make sure to subscribe. And I will see all of you guys in the next video.